Today, guys, we are going to talk about how to grow your hamstrings. I am a WNBF pro, been competing for 10 years, been in the gym for 20 years, and I've helped hundreds of people grow hanging hams. I've also spoken to many experts within the field and have a good understanding of what can lead to maximal growth within your hamstrings, and we're going to cover that today. I think the biggest thing to understand with the hamstrings is that they are a biarticulate muscle. That means they cross the knee and the hip joint. And that means, similar to the quads, how you can't maximally grow your quads just through squat patterns. You want a knee extension. The same happens with the hamstrings, where you can't maximally grow them just through your deadlift patterns. You want to have a hip extension pattern, those hip hinges, but you also want a knee flexion pattern. So you want some leg curls and you want some sort of RDLs or good mornings, and we're going to go over those. For full development, you want to make sure that you're training every function that that muscle group has, so make sure to do this for the hamstrings. Let's cover some of my favorite hip extension patterns. I think the bread and butter for a lot of individuals, myself included, is a Romanian deadlift. So this is where generally you start at the top of the lift, so normally in a rack, and you just look to extend the hips back, push the hips back, keep them high, have soft knees, and whilst you push the hips back, you have the soft knees, the bar then will translate down and you keep the bar close to your body. This will really stretch out the hamstrings. You also hit a lot of glutes, and you'll also be obviously training lots of the upper back and the erectors through this lift. Your range of motion will be dictated by coming only as low. So the bar may only come as low as just below your knees if that's where you hit maximal kind of hip flexion. So your hips are no longer moving back. And if you were to go lower, then you might find that your hips have to lower and your knees might have to translate forward, and that actually starts shortening the hamstrings and it will continue to lengthen the glutes. So if you did want to make a RDL more glute biased, then you could allow the hips to sink, the knees to come forward a little bit and slack the hamstrings but get more glute lengthening. But the way I tend to like RDLs, especially for hamstrings, you don't want to allow that to happen. So these are some keys. You might find that some people can come all the way to the floor and achieve this. Some people might even be able to do a deficit. It's going to depend person to person, anatomy to anatomy. But big hamstrings can definitely be developed through the RDL. Some others that I really like is a straight leg deadlift. Now, this is something that typically you start from the floor. And the difference here versus an RDL is really that. Like one starts from the floor, one starts from a rack. Some people might argue that a straight leg deadlift is with straighter knees. And so I have time for that argument. But I would tend to find if you have straighter knees, then you aren't going to be able to go from the floor. And so that won't happen. What I tend to find with the straight leg deadlift is often people have to get a bit more range through allowing their back to flex more. So they might start in a slightly more, allow their back to go into more flexion and therefore train the erectors a little bit more. Similar to if you went to continue to get more depth on the RDL, you might introduce more glutes. You could also get that extra range through rounding your back and getting more erector stimulus there, because now the erectors are starting to flex. So you have to be careful to understand that, you can get really stretched hamstrings, but you might hit more erectors this way. That's at least what happens for me. You could try and have straighter knees. You won't be able to probably have as much range of motion. And that can also be really effective. What I tend to find happens when you try and have really like stiff knees or very straight, a very straight leg position, is that it just starts to take away from your ability to actually load it and work really hard. When I start having that form and then I start to progress it, I find I'm so much focused on this perfect knee position that I don't feel like I'm strong in the lift. And I really like a technique where people can be really strong, feel like they can progress it really well and hit the target muscle versus like trying to fit this like pristine, biomechanically sound, like perfect model. So that's kind of something to consider for the straight leg deadlift. And then with good mornings, they can be excellent, of course. And that's just, you perform it just like an RDL, but the load is through your upper back. I do prefer these done with a low bar position versus a high bar position. What that does is it just shortens the moment arm at the erectors at the back, and you'll probably notice that they're quite erector and back heavy anyway, just because of where it's loading you through the upper back in that way. But these can be great because unlike an RDL or a straight leg deadlift, you don't have to it's easier just to walk into a Smith machine or into a rack and just have it there. They're easier to load and easier to just kind of get into. They're not so much bread and butter for a lot of people, though, I would say, because I just tend to find that, again, they're often limited by the erectors more so than the hamstrings and the glutes. But they can be a great lift, and I'm doing them here in the Smith machine, which is fantastic. Again, it's really easy to get into, and the setup cost and time is really, really low, but I don't tend to find them as effective as RDLs for people. For whatever reason, you can't seem to get as good a stretch, and they seem to be limited by the lower back more so, even with a low bar position. With a high bar position, I think even more so, even more limited by the erectors, but they can be a decent tool in your toolbox, obviously, because you're not gripping through your upper body and using your hands. That might be a situation where that might be beneficial to you, but you're also not going to put maybe as much strain through the upper back as maybe an RDL, which I'm not saying that's a bad or good thing. It's just something to recognize. And then back extensions, or if you've got a glute ham raise, these can also be great alternatives as well, where you can really focus on getting a good stretch on the hamstrings. And again, you're going to be loading very similar tissues. You're probably going to miss out again on as much upper back involvement when you are doing these versus a heavy RDL or a straight leg deadlift. But the erectors are going to be involved, the glutes, the hamstrings, they're all going to be involved. And it can be an also great alternative to do. On this particular back extension, you'll see that I shove my feet very low on the platform, and that is to enhance the stretch. Also, you could raise the front of the platform, again, to make it a little bit more lengthened biased. That's one of the only things with a back extension, is it's not as complementary in terms of resistance profile as, say, an RDL, where RDL's hardest at the bottom, which is where you're strongest, and easiest at the top where you're weakest. So it's complementary in this sense. But the back extensions, they tend to actually get a bit harder, and they've got a bit of an opposite resistance profile. So they can be useful as a lengthened partial, for example. You might want to include some form of lengthened partials within this lift, and they can be useful in that sense. So that's kind of your hip extension patterns, and they're some of the ones that I really like. Then we want to train knee flexion. So they're through your leg curl patterns. Now you have basically three different patterns, kind of two, because a lying leg curl or a standing leg curl, they're very similar in terms of you are flat, you're not flexed at the hips. Whereas a seated leg curl, you have that hip flexion going on. And the biggest difference between the two is that because of the starting position that you're in with your hips, the seated leg curl actually gets you at a longer muscle length. So it'll train you at longer muscle lengths. And within the research, when they've compared lying to seated leg curls, they've found seated leg curls to provide more growth. And that is likely down to training you at a longer muscle length. However, with the lying leg curl, interestingly enough, the sartorius grew more. This is a important muscle for bodybuilding aesthetics and for on stage. For a lot of people, it's not such a concern. The sartorius actually gets lengthened more when you're in that lying or prone position. So that's just something to take note of, not to throw any exercises out. But if I was to pick one, I'd be okay, a seated leg curl is probably superior. Some people like to lean forward on a seated leg curl, and as if they're doing a toe stretch, and that can lengthen the hamstrings further and may provide more growth. But I also, and I just see these as variations, like to push myself back into the seat and drive the thigh support down onto my knees. I find that to be a very stable position and can work well as a variation as well. You're kind of trading off length for kind of stability and potential loading, I think, if you lean forward or kind of sit back. Also, when I'm performing, you'll see these standing leg curls that I'm doing. Not only do I put a yoga block there to try and enhance the stretch, but I also really try and lean over to kind of almost mimic what a seated leg position would be to, again, get a bit more stretch than I otherwise would. The other thing is, stretch is great, but with longer muscle length training, such as your hip hinges are all going to be this way, you're training muscles at a long muscle length and loading it really heavily, lots of people get very sore from little work. And so a shorter biased lift, like a lying leg curl or a standing leg curl, not only, lengthen partials could be useful in those sort of situations, because again, you could probably get some more reps out that way and take the hamstrings closer to failure. You'll see when I perform these, I basically do them exclusively as lengthen partials. The lying leg curl machine that I'm using here is a Strive machine, and so you can pick it to bias the length and range anyway, which is what I do. But what I was trying to say is the movements that are less damaging, such as the lying standing leg curls, can allow you to accumulate a little bit more volume without the excessive damage and fatigue that might be produced through these longer muscle length lifts. So they can be complementary in that sense, just like, hey, doing some leg extensions with your quad work, not only to train the rec fem, but because it's less damaging, or doing a hip thrust to get a bit more glute volume, again, a bit less damaging because it doesn't train you at such a long muscle length with heavy amounts of load. They can be synergistic in that way. Another one to consider is a Nordic curl. I don't often think about this because I think for most people, it's a bit of an awkward lift to set up and to practically do in a gym, but the eccentric is brutal, and the lengthening eccentric, it's almost like a ab rollout in that sense. Ab rollouts, again, very damaging, very lengthening, very like heavy eccentric. And a lot of people get very sore from those. Similar here with like the Nordic curls, they are absolutely brutal, and they're just nothing I've ever done a lot of, because I've just found practically they're not as easy as just going into like a leg curl machine or doing your hip hinges, as it were. So yeah, the two functions are being trained. You're getting your hip extension and you're getting your knee flexion through a variety of different modalities, which all have like pluses and minuses to them. So you'll often hear people talk about that 10 to 20 sets per muscle group per week. And this is based off some meta-analyses within the evidence. And I think that for many people is a great starting point, but it's really just a very vague starting point, kind of similar to a calorie calculator you might use. It can give you a kind of starting point, but you need to, in real time, look at your body weight and see how things go and trends over time and track your nutrition. And then you can make modifications to get towards your kind of appropriate calorie intake for your goals at hand. Similar with your training volume. And you'd also want to start towards the lower end. But I think the hamstrings are a bit unique. They are a bit more fast twitch dominant. Again, a lot of the movements that you do are like heavy eccentrics, which are very damaging at long muscle lengths. So many people find that their volume tolerance is much lower. In fact, it's one of those unique situations where I've seen people need as little as like 3 or 4 sets of hamstrings per week, and they can't recover from more than that, training close to failure with like decent lifts. So that's quite rare, I would say, to be that low. I would say on average, most people I train around maybe 8 sets per muscle for the hamstring per week, and distributing that a little bit 50-50 between kind of hip extension and knee flexion, and if anything, biasing a little bit more knee flexion than hip extension, because those kind of deadlift, RDLs, hip hinge patterns can be very, very fatiguing. Of course, it depends on the ones that you pick. But if it's your RDL and a lying leg curl, which can be potentially synergistic too, because you're training a bit more short biased, a bit more lengthen biased in that sense. Not that you have to set it up that way, but that could be something you consider. That can be great. And just always start on that lower end versus that higher end. So some takeaways. For maximal hamstring growth, you want to make sure that you train every function, because it's a biarticulate muscle group. It crosses the knee and the hip joint. You want to have a knee flexion pattern, and you want a hip extension pattern. So that's your hip hinges, your RDLs, good morning, so on and so forth. And that is your leg curl variations. Potentially also a Nordic leg curl could be beneficial. You want to be careful with your volume that you're doing, training close to failure, because you are able to load it at length. It gets damaged very easily. It's maybe a bit more of a fast switch muscle group as well for a lot of people. So volume tolerance seems to be quite low. So I would start maybe around 4 to 6 sets for that muscle per week, maybe splitting it somewhat 50-50 between your knee flexion and hip extension patterns. Start off there and then modify as you move forward. You could potentially even start lower than that, and that can be a great way to train it. And don't be afraid to mix modalities a little bit. There are benefits to each of these. Like I said, good mornings often train the erectors a little bit more, same with straight leg deadlifts, whereas doing like a back extension is a little bit more volume tolerant due to being a bit more short biased. You could do some length and partials with that lift. Same with lying leg curls, seated leg curls. Lying leg curls, you're going to get a bit more sartorius, but your kind of seated leg curl might be a bit more bread and butter, because that is getting you to a longer muscle length generally. So it might be a better investment, especially if you aren't able to do as many sets. If you did want to try and push your volume, you might be better off pushing it through exercises that are more potentially short biased and not as damaging, such as the lying or the standing leg curl in that sense too. So guys, hopefully this has been helpful. I'd love to hear your thoughts and feelings, what your go-to hamstring movements are, and I'll catch you in the next one. And I should always remind you, at Revive Stronger, we're an online coaching company. Maximizing our clients' muscle growth for their goals at hand is our job and role. We watch form videos, we do their programming to get them to their best training program to provide the best results from their efforts. We essentially level people up because a lot of you guys watching are very knowledgeable. You kind of know what you should be doing, but sometimes practically applying it to yourself, you haven't got that level of experience to know if it's the right thing, and you maybe lack a bit of confidence, potentially program hop a little bit because you're seeing new studies or new information all the time. We get you on a consistent plan that is individualized to you, your goals, and providing the best results. And so you can have confidence in that, be a bit more of an athlete, less overthinking, more results. So if you are interested in that, that's always linked in the description too.